The focus of this tutorial is all about processing reverb. Now I've wrote processing Reverb Returns because that's the traditional, that's the classic way of setting up reverb. But as you'll see in a couple of minutes, as long as you're able to isolate the reverb from the original signal, all of these techniques will work the exact same way and give you the same sort of effects. We all like to produce and mix music differently, and a lot of times that comes down to like organization and how things look on the screen. So just remember that there's always more than one way to accomplish something in the digital audio workstation, and you'll just have to find what works best for you. So this doesn't mean that you have to set up every reverb in a send and return configuration if it doesn't make sense for you to do that. So we're mainly going to be using EQ and compression. What I should say is we're going to start out with EQ and compression, and that's going to probably take up the bulk of the time, but we'll use that then as a springboard to get into kind of the Wild West, the open frontier that is processing reverb. This has become a very popular technique, especially in the mixing community, but for producing music and creating music, I actually think it's a lot more fun and a little bit more open because people haven't tried all of these combinations yet, and you'll see just how easy it is to do this and how diverse of sounds you can really get. So look forward to that. If you can get through some of the more technical, practical, utilitarian stuff at the beginning, you're going to get really stoked and excited for what you can do beyond that. The focus here really, and the focus with almost any sort of processing tutorial or processing discussion, it normally comes down to signal flow considerations. And when I say signal flow, I just mean the order of your effects. So your EQ goes into your compressor goes into your reverb goes into an EQ. Why is it being set up in that chain? And specifically here, and what I want to focus on is with our EQ, with our compression, with our delays and so forth, why would I want to put that compressor before the reverb versus putting it after the reverb? What sort of differences in sound am I going to get? What sort of like theoretical differences are going to happen here? What's the reason for doing this? As long as you can understand the reason and the theory, it makes listening to what actually happens a lot easier to grasp. And from there, you can then decide, okay, which version do I prefer? Because there's never going to be a right answer every single time. You have to experiment. You have to be willing to try things in different ways. That's what making music, that's what making art is all about. The techniques shown in this tutorial can be applied in any DAW with the majority of reverbs on the market, with plus the default effects that come bundled with your DAW. That sentence doesn't make a lot of sense, so I can actually break it down a lot easier for you. You can use any combination of reverbs and processors that you have. It's really about the ideas. So if you want to go with third-party stuff, feel free to do it. If you want to use the stuff that comes bundled with your DAW, feel free to do it. If you want to use freeware, feel free to do it. These ideas go beyond the tools themselves. That being said, not all reverbs hold up to processing as well as others. Sometimes the more expensive ones, they have so many built-in processors inside of the reverb that trying to do anything externally doesn't always work that well. Sometimes convolution reverb doesn't hold up that well to additional effects processing. So again, you'll just have to experiment. You'll just have to use your ears, and you'll find some combinations work great, others, not so much. So we're really learning here together, and if you stumble across a combination that works really well, feel free to tell us about it either in the forum or in the comments below. But quickly, I wanted to review the send and return configuration and why it works so well with reverb. Why has that precedent been set where we always tend to set up reverb in a send and return configuration? There are really a number of reasons for it. I think early on, the real reason was as a means to save CPU. Reverbs are a lot of delays, at least the algorithmic ones, and to generate a lot of delays takes a lot of CPU. So if you can conserve CPU and just have to use one or two reverbs, which can then be sent from or sent into from a variety of different tracks, you're going to cut down on processor load. But I think over time, we've really gone beyond that and have realized that the send and return just makes a lot of sense mainly for variation. So if you think about the real world, for example, and being in different spaces and listening to different sounds, particular sounds may have more or less audible reverb depending on where the listener is located in relation to the sound that they're hearing. So, for example, if you're in a large concert hall and you're 3 feet away from the stage, you will hear the direct signal from that violin, right? You are right up there, it hits you immediately, and then there's normally like a little bit of a delay for the sound to then bounce off all the back walls and all over the place, and then it comes back to you as a reverb. That's just the effect of being very close to that sound. However, if you're in the back of the concert hall, by the time that reverb gets to you, okay, it's already, or I should say, by the time the direct signal gets to you, it's already combined with a lot of these different reflections and bounces off the wall, and it sounds completely differently. If you've ever sung before, or if you've ever played an instrument on a stage in a really nice kind of acoustic hall, you know that effect that occurs when you're playing out and how it kind of comes back and hits you a little bit later. So where you're located in a space can drastically change how that sound is going to get to your ear, how you're going to perceive it in relation to the space you're in. So working in a digital audio workstation, we have this great ability to emulate different spaces. So it could be like we are sitting right in front of, like, you know, the lead vocalist, but the piano is actually coming from way behind us and it's coming with reverb attached. Setting up a send and return allows us to get this kind of variation by how much reverb that we're sending in. However, we can't really vary something like pre-delay for every single instrument. So there's always this trade-off. There's a give and a take to realism and then to this kind of artificial effect. And when it comes to doing any sort of processing in a DAW, it really is an artificial effect that we're going for. So having a variable amount of send means we can, to some extent, emulate real-world behavior. How much reverb do we want attached to this versus how little reverb do we want to attach to particular sounds? Normally, the more exciting upfront sounds have less reverb. The sounds that are meant to be a little bit more in the background as a texture have less. And we can do that with the variable send amount with our send and return. Reverb may also be set up in classic parallel or layered configuration depending on the circumstance. So this is exactly what I was just talking about with variation. If we want to have a specialty reverb on a vocal with maybe a lengthy pre-delay, we're going to have to set that up independently. And in that case, going with maybe a parallel configuration makes more sense because it's only being used on that particular part. So this is all about context. It's all about having an idea and knowing how to execute it. So just a very brief review of the different ways you can configure your routings if you're planning to process a reverb independent of a dry signal. And when I say dry signal, I just mean no reverb in this case. So the classic is to use the send and return structure. I already have that set up here. You might see it over to the right, all your return tracks over here and all of your tracks that you can send from, aka just your regular tracks over on the left. Or if you're in an arrangement view, maybe it works top to bottom. In this program, to create a new return track, I actually do what's called an effect track, but exactly the same thing. And now to go into this effect, I can do it in a variety of ways. I can either send it from this knob here, or I can go into the reverb, find the track I need, send it in like so, or go to the mix view and do the same thing. Again, you'll have to consult your DAW's documentation on how this works, but it's pretty much the same in every single program. So if I play back this vocal part, I can send it into the reverb. So that's pretty straightforward, but really where send and return has a strength over, say, just a regular parallel configuration is that you can send a variable amount of signal from multiple tracks into the same effect, in this case, into the reverb. So if I'm just playing this back, and it's going to sound just all bad right now, we're going to come back to this in a minute, but I can send in both the piano and this other vocal part into the reverb and have it done so in a variable fashion. So I might just want a little bit of vocal and then a lot on the piano. किससे क्या कहूँ किससे क्या कहूँ किससे like so. And that's really where send and return has such a great benefit to any other routing scheme. Of course, it also lessens CPU because you only have to deal with this one reverb as compared to having 80 different reverbs. That being said, in the modern age with the faster computers and, with even the plugins themselves not maybe taking as many resources as they have in the past, they've gotten much more efficient with these things. You can set up your processing chains a little bit differently. For example, let's say that on this vocal, we wanted to have a specialty reverb, like a plate reverb or something like that. If I'm only going to be using it on this one part, what is the point and reason of me setting up an entire send and return configuration? Personally, I think that's a little bit overkill and actually isn't going to keep things as organized as I'd like it. And again, this is kind of personal preference. So you have two options here. One would be to duplicate this track and call this Vox Reverb. And then just like we've done with our parallel configurations in the past, we're going to put the reverb on here and put it to its extreme settings, so 100%. If this isn't 100%, we're still going to get some dry signal. Well, this is what the dry signal is supposed to be, and we set the blend here. So if we play these guys together, you'll hear one with a lot of reverb, one with no reverb. So this is basically the same thing as going in and cranking this all the way to the top. Maybe it's even more than that here, which is fine because now to actually set the balance, we're just going to use our slider. So just a small amount or a lot. And then obviously if I was going to do processing, I could put it at the front or at the back of this reverb. And then what makes this worth our while is that we can actually go in and group this, close it down like so. And if I am going to use a specialty reverb on like one part, this would probably be a way I might go about doing it. Now, luckily for us, even cooler for us in this program, is that we can set up layers. Okay, so if I go in here and I grab my effects layer, this allows me to do parallel processing all within the track, but the result is going to be exactly the same. So I just now need to have two versions, and to do that, I'm just going to bring two tool devices in. So this is my one chain, this is my second chain, and again, we'll call this first one Vox Dry, and we'll call this second one Vox Wet, or Vox Reverb, whatever the case may be. And again, I'll just go in here, I'll copy this, and I'll paste it. And as you can see, it actually just created a new chain for me, which is fine. I'll just go back in and call this one Reverb. And again, it's the same thing. I'm going to set my blend to taste. And then if I wanted to do additional processing on the front or on the back end here, I would come in and I would bring in my effect right here. So if I knew that I wanted, say, dynamics, some kind of compressor, I could just bring that on to the front and I could just go to town processing specifically the reverb independent of the vocal part. So those are the different ways you could go about configuring your reverbs. If you want to just stick to the basic send and return, that's absolutely fine. But for some people, I know it definitely works better for their organizational sense, myself included, to maybe set something up like this if I'm only going to be using that reverb on one particular part, like a specialty plate reverb on a vocal or a spring reverb on a guitar, something that I'm not going to use throughout the project. I'd rather keep things nice and organized and, when possible, consolidate it all to one track. Now that we've looked at and briefly discussed the different ways of configuring reverb in the digital audio workstation, let's do an additional example using the classic send and return one reverb. So what we're trying to do here is visualize our mix space. So let's imagine that we're in some kind of a rectangular room. The red dot signifies the listener. We have the lead vocals, which are supposed to be right up front. The piano's a little bit back and off to the right. And the synth pad is a little bit further back, all the way in the back of the room. And then maybe, just maybe slightly off to the left. Now you're going to think, well, shouldn't we use 3 different reverbs? And we could do that, and we could maybe really get what we wanted. But believe it or not, with the classic send and return configuration and just one reverb, we can actually still get this sort of effect. And we can do so pretty easily. So the results are going to be drastic. We'll jump into the DAW and just kind of walk through this in real time. For the most part, all of the examples that we do in these technical tutorials are purely theoretical. This way, you just get a sense for what it is the effect is doing, and then you can kind of go in, take it in your own direction, and apply it in your music when and where you think it's appropriate. That being said, I did just want to quickly run through maybe a little more of a practical example of how we could use basically just one reverb effect, as well as our volume faders and pan positioning, to really set different layers and depths of space. Okay, so kind of doing or trying to emulate what we just looked at in that picture. So in that picture, the vocal was the main thing. It was what was right up in front, so I'll just mute the other two parts for now. Turn this up a little bit, and then I am going to send this into our reverb. But of all of the parts, I'm going to send this in the least because it's going to be right up in front, right in our face. And if it's right in our face, there's not going to be a whole lot of reverb attached to it. So let's just go in here and send just a little bit, just till we hear it, and then I'm going to back it off. I'll go a little more extreme in the example just because of the compression ratios and stuff like that when the videos are uploaded.
किससे क्या कहूँ, किससे क्या कहूँ,
So without reverb.
किससे क्या कहूँ.
And I'd even probably lessen this by maybe 4 or 5 additional dB of send going in if I was doing this for real, but that gives you an idea. So that's our vocal, that's right up in front. The next layer was the piano, and I think we had that positioned off to the right. So let's bring the piano in now.
किससे क्या कहूँ.
That's a pretty good balance. Since it's already favoring the left side, why don't we just work with that and push it a little bit further to the left?
किससे क्या कहूँ, किससे क्या कहूँ.
And so I want a little bit more reverb on this part, nothing too drastic, but just something to make it feel as though it's at that second layer back. So let's start to send in.
किससे क्या कहूँ, 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 किससे क्या.
Let's just check it. So that's pretty good. And then for the last part, the pad, this is supposed to be sitting well in the background, and I'll probably put it a little bit off to the right as well, but let's just go ahead and bring that in now.
किससे क्या कहूँ, किससे क्या कहूँ, किससे क्या कहूँ, किससे क्या कहूँ.
And now in the case of the pad, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get a little bit experimental. Since by default, this is actually sending in post fader, it is taking into account what we have set here, and it's set very quietly. So if I solo this and even jack this to the extreme, that's not even enough reverb for what I want. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to send it in pre. You can hear just how extreme that is. And now I'm actually going to set a balance using this pre-fader and actually even turning this down further. So what we're really doing is adding more reverb to this than we are dry signal. Fairly experimental, fairly, oh no, you shouldn't do that. But if it works, it works. So let's go ahead and set that up.
किससे क्या कहूँ, 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 किससे क्या कहूँ.
And there you have it. So if we go back and listen to the original, and and then listen to what we were able to come up with, you'll hear the night and day difference just using reverb, our volume faders, and a little bit of pan.
किससे क्या कहूँ, किससे क्या कहूँ.
I'd probably also want to go in and compress that piano a little bit, but you get the general idea and how you can create these different levels and layers of space by using a simple send and return configuration with reverb. With everything that we've covered on the course thus far, I'm hoping that you're very comfortable with reverb already. So there's no reason to really review reverb and the basic setup. We kind of have just done that in the past few slides. And hopefully you're now ready to kind of get your big boy pants on and get ready for the processing angle, which is what this tutorial is all about. And we're going to get started with compression followed by reverb, aka compress in. So the signal flow here is very straightforward. Compressor followed by reverb. Before we go any further, a word of caution, something that I talked about in the last tutorial. You need to make sure that the signal you are sending into the reverb is actually being compressed. If you have the compressor just sitting there and you're not limiting the dynamic range at all, then there's no reason to have that compressor there. It's not making a difference. It's just going through it and then into the reverb like it normally would. So we'll be setting this up and talking about some strategies to make sure that you're getting some limiting of dynamic range, but just be aware that you need to see that gain reduction needle or meter doing something in order to actually make a difference here. So what are the benefits of compressing on the way in? Well, what you really need to think about is the RT60. So how long does it take that reverb to decay by 60 dB, or specifically just the decay time? So some reverbs will use RT60. Most just use decay time because it's easier to grasp and understand. RT60 sounds like some kind of technical term, something you'd see in a weird math formula. It doesn't have to be that confusing. But by limiting the dynamic range going in, this means that the reverb tail will be more easily heard. Thus, you can shorten the decay time and actually get the same effect as having a longer decay time. Let me explain that in a little bit better English. So let's say that we have a decay time of 3 seconds. Now, if you have a very busy mix, you are not going to hear that decay lasting for 3 seconds. You might hear a second of it or so. And then you just lose a lot of it. It's there, it's taking up space that you don't want to take up, but you have to set that longer decay time in order to get the effect you want. Well, not necessarily. If you compress hard going into the reverb, this means that the reverb itself is going to be much more audible, especially the decay. And if the decay is more audible in that longer amount of time, you can then reduce the reverb time. You can reduce the decay overall and you get that same effect. So what before was maybe a 3-second reverb to get the sound you wanted could now be converted into a 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds. And this makes a world of difference in a busy mix that still needs reverb. Therefore, you eliminate tails fading off that you can't hear but are still happening. This takes up space, it limits clarity, it sometimes causes a little bit of a mushiness or a blurriness, and if you need things to be very crystal clear, this is a fantastic technique that allows you to just get as much reverb as is needed, shorten those decay times, but still get the desired effect you're going for. And remember, for every genre of music, these strategies may be more or less applicable. From here on out, the examples are going to be more theoretical, and so you have to remember that you have to go into your own DAW and experiment. You don't just have to use a vocal sound. You can also use something like a snare. That's a very popular reverb tester outer. You could use more of like a plucky synth. Anything that's maybe a bit more percussive will work quite well for the majority of these examples. But what I really would like you to try to do is apply this to your actual compositions in progress and see what kind of a difference it makes or what kind of a difference it doesn't make. I like to keep the things theoretical in the examples so that we can really focus on the techniques, but you're really going to only get the full benefit when you go in and try this out in context. All right, so without further ado, let's talk about compressing on the way into the reverb. So we have this vocal part.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And we're sending in a decent amount, but what I really want is a much kind of longer reverb tail, or something that I perceive as being longer. So you have to remember that when you're working on a production, normally the volume is pretty low in comparison to what it's going to be at the final mastering stage. So in order to get that lengthier tail, I sometimes have to set this really long. So I'm starting to lose it here, but we can still see that signal is happening. And when we bring up the overall level, that's going to be the thing that gets brought up. And that's where you start to then have some problems and things start clashing. Maybe not clashing, but it just sort of gets muddy. And there's just a lot of information all happening at the same time that you're not anticipating. Because as of right now, it doesn't sound like it's causing any problems. It's just going for the length that you want it to go. But you have to realize something like 7 seconds is actually a really long time. This isn't 7 seconds beyond the end of this clip here by any stretch of the imagination. So in reality, what I'd want to do is probably compress the signal pretty hard before going into the reverb to ensure that I can then get a much shorter decay time, but still get the effect that I'm going for. In a lot of cases, it just ends up sounding better too, because you don't get as much of a buildup as you do with something that's 7 seconds in length. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to duplicate this for now. And I'm going to start by bringing in my dynamics. So we're going to keep life very simple for ourselves, and we're just going to do a top-down approach here. And so I'm going to start to send some information in. I'll try to send about the same amount. I'm going to send a little bit more just to make sure that I get something.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And that's really fine. And I'm just going to go ahead and start to compress this down in more of our classic, almost parallel configuration. Super fast attack, pretty steep ratio here.
Jalesmin
smooth out that knee a little bit.
sannidhim kuru.
And what I really want to do is just kind of solo this part out here.
Jalesmin sannidhim Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So really the wisest thing to do in this example would be to go back to the reverb and check and see here how much signal is just coming in from the send.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So about -23. And let's see what we're having here.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
-27, so we should be bringing back in maybe 4 or 5 dB here. This should be good.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
It's going to be close enough for our purposes, but now we can bring it into the reverb and hear what happens.
Jalesmin Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
Suddenly that super lengthy reverb tail is a lot lengthier. We can really hear it now. And so this is way too long for what I'm going for, way too long compared to what we had set up before. So the beauty of this is that I can go in and pull back on this pretty drastically. I could bring it all the way back down to, 2.5, 3 seconds.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And then end up with the effect that I want. Now, clearly this is becoming way overpowered because of the compression and the output gain that we've added, but I can just go in here and I can add a tool device. And we can make up for that without a problem. And this is the way I would probably do it, because if we were sending multiple things in, we still would probably want to make sure that it was getting compressed pretty hard. So having this makeup here at the end is really the wisest approach, I think.
Jalesmin sannidhim.
Let's see, how much did we gain? About 4.5.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So you can hear how it cuts off much quicker, but it has the same kind of effect that we were going for before. Basically, the way to think about this is we're not wasting any decay time on the reverb where it's going to potentially be blending with things that we don't want it to blend into. Like, let's say this is a transition from one section to the next. That's probably not something we'd want. And where we really start to hear this is when we bring in some peak limiting. So let's pretend that we're now going to the final stage. We'll really crank this in here, add some 10 dB or so, and listen to the difference between these two. So this is with the compression applied.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And you can hear how quick it cuts off as compared to what we have here.
Jales.
It always helps to turn the reverb on. And it's just we have to let it kind of fade out now because it's so long. And this is part of the problem, is that it builds up.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And I clearly didn't do as good of a job balancing gains as I thought, but you can hear how long this is continuing on for. And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. So this seems like such a small, insignificant thing when we're doing it just in this theoretical context, but in an actual mix, you would be amazed how much space you save if and when you do need kind of that lengthy reverb effect on some part, but you don't want to have to waste any of that additional decay time. Compressing on the way in, a fantastic strategy to deal with that. Now we can talk about the inverse, which is compressing on the way out. The signal flow being the reverb followed by the compressor. The benefits, similar to the first slide, but with a very different sound. In some ways, I would actually say this effect is more unnatural since you're affecting the reverb itself, which you normally would expect to have a natural decay. So you can do the exact same thing we just did when we compressed going in. You can make the compression be pretty strong, pretty heavy, quick attack time, release set to taste. And if you do that, then you're able to reduce some of the decay time, but sometimes at the expense of the reverb no longer sounding very natural. At least the sound coming in, if it's heavily compressed or whatever, it doesn't really impact how that reverb is going to respond. But once you start processing the reverberated signal itself, you're kind of altering the entire characteristic of that reverb. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. Of course, we'll have the examples that you can listen to here for yourself. But other applications, and sometimes you might combine and have a compressor going in and compressor going out, you might actually use this reverb to give you a little bit of a pumping or a moving action, a subtle compression that pulses with the rest of the track. And this is done a lot of times by mix engineers who like to kind of put a little bit of compression on everything. So they'll use similar settings that they've used everywhere else, and it can sometimes flow along with the track a little bit. If you get those timings to go along rhythmically with whatever the BPM is, it can sometimes have a really good, strong impact, usually very subtle. But again, mixing and making music is a lot of small changes to lead up to a big result. And the final application is the sidechain, very popular move. If you have a long reverb tail, you can actually sidechain the reverb specifically to, say, a kick drum or a snare drum and have it kind of pump and jump out of the way when that kick is hitting. Sometimes this has maybe been abused, but at other times, I really like that effect. So this is completely unnatural. It doesn't exist in nature. But a lot of music production is about doing things outside of the box and getting experimental. So it doesn't always have to be about sticking to nature. Compressing on the way out of the reverb, so reverb into compression, can do the same thing that it did when we put it before, with the difference being that we're actually compressing the reverb. Before we weren't. We were just compressing the signal that's coming in. Now we're actually compressing that process that normally is coded to be a natural kind of fade. So sometimes this can work really well, sometimes it doesn't. It's really kind of up to your own ear. And if you're willing to go with something that maybe sounds processed, sounds possibly artificial. So we have our vocal, and let's send it into the reverb and do kind of what we did before.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
We'll start with a very long reverb time.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And now we'll go in and compress the reverb. We'll just again do what we did before to make life very easy for ourselves to understand what we're doing. We'll do it pretty aggressively, so fast attack time here. So once we apply that makeup gain, and you can even hear it now how it kind of sounds unnatural when it's being compressed. And it's also because this has been done very aggressively, but you get the idea. So I'll start to bring in that makeup gain. Let's turn this off first and just see where it's peaking out at. 10.8, 9.6, 8.8. Okay, 8.8. Now we'll turn the dynamics on, do it again just so we can try to get a fair gain match. So again, about 9. And we'll listen to a before and after and just hear how much longer and how much more prevalent that decay tail is. So here it is without the dynamics. And then with the dynamics on the reverb. So yeah, you can really hear that tail, which means we can go back into the reverb and decrease this greatly. And then again, I'm just going to start to pull back on this output gain since we don't need it to get the reference right. So you get that sort of compressed reverb sound. When it blends like this, it sounds pretty good, but if we needed it to be louder, it would be pretty unnatural. So something like that can work really well if you need that kind of a reverb sound and are afraid of it taking up too much space. So that would be the first example of using Dynamics Processor in this way. The other thing that you might do, and this sometimes happens, is let's say that you have a drum loop here. And we'll go ahead and just loop that over. And you want to compress these drums. And you're kind of syncing it to tempo. So let's say that we're kind of liking the vibe of this. We brought in our vocals. One thing that you might consider doing, and I'm actually getting annoyed by the attackiness, I'm just actually going to bring that down. So one thing you might do to try to make the vocal and the drums fit together is actually use compression settings that are somewhat similar in a very subtle way. So I might go and I might even just copy this over and paste it onto the reverb here. So I have that release time that's set the same. And now I might just try to get a little bit of a blend happening. Turn off the makeup. We're getting that little bit of movement there with the release that should be corresponding with the movement of the compressor that we have on the drums. And then if this same compressor was put onto the vocals, now we really have a party. We don't need to send as much. So this is a fairly popular strategy. It's done more so on kind of like acoustic mixes where you have just a lot of different recordings and no way of tying them together. But that being said, it can still be done in any context and is something that's done from time to time. I actually never really do this, but it is done. So that would be your second strategy here of compressing the reverb. And in this case, we're not really disrupting things too much with the natural decay. We're doing it in a very subtle fashion. So that would be the second example. The third example is, of course, the classic sort of like sidechain effect on the reverb. So to get the reverb to really pump along with some kind of trigger. And in this example, we'll be using this kick drum as the trigger, and we'll have it going up against the vocal reverb. So let's go ahead here and just have our reverb going. We'll over exaggerate it again. Bring it all up. And let's make this reverb time pretty long so that we can really get some effect here. And I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to add my dynamics. And this is really just the ghost track, so I don't even really necessarily want to hear it. We'll do it first where you can hear it. So I want to set my sidechain to be coming from the ghost, and let's do it with the ghost post for right now. So that's actually triggering based on what you're hearing, based on this setting.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So you can hear that like so. This is a very popular classic thing that's been done a million times. More likely though, you'll probably have this set to something like mute this entirely.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And then you can choose just how aggressive you want it to be by using the threshold and using the knee control and stuff like that. So there's a lot of variety you can get.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So because we have that really hard knee, you're hearing the click, and that will work just fine if you actually have a kick drum that's playing. But if you have nothing, you will want to soften that.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So we've lessened it a little bit, not completely, but that's the way that works. That's the way you can definitely work with dynamics post reverb, a very obvious effect and something that, again, like I said, it's been used countless times and usually to a great effect. So have some fun with that one. That's something that a lot of times people wonder how they get that sound. Well, this is how they do it. It's pretty straightforward, and unfortunately, there's no secrets or magics here. It's just basic technical knowledge and application. Equalization on the way in. Signal flow, EQ, followed by the reverb. Benefits, controlling the frequency content of what enters the reverb. Very different to what's happening with the sound that's exiting the reverb. So the primary application here a lot of times is to high pass going into the reverb to avoid any low end getting in there and really kind of darkening things up, clouding the overall image. Also, sometimes you might have a high shelf, make the reverb shimmer and shine. That being said, you can absolutely experiment here. There are no rules. And I think when we go in and look at the examples, this will make a lot more sense to you. So let's just go ahead and do it. If you made it through the compression portion and you understood everything perfectly, the rest of this presentation should be a breeze for you, because we're now moving into EQ, either EQ in or EQ out, and it's the same sort of methodology and theory to compression. Do I want to actually process the reverb itself, aka post, or do I want to process what's coming into the reverb, aka pre or before the reverb? So this is a little template we're going to be working with, and I'm just going to remove these sends for now.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So let's imagine that I want to send both of these into the reverb. Okay, I'll do it from the mix view this time just to change things up. Let's start with the vocal.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And now let's try the bass, and you're going to maybe start to hear a little bit of a problem, especially with clarity.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And obviously for these examples, we're way overdoing it so you can hear it, but that's kind of the point. So when we start to bring that bass in, you're hearing a lot of these low frequencies going through the reverb very wide and pretty much clouding this overall image of just these two parts. And that's not something I want. So I have two options. Well, I really have three options. One option is just don't send the bass into the reverb at all. But I want to send it in there. I want to bring these two parts together, so that's not going to work. The other option would be I could EQ after the reverb. Okay, we'll experiment with that in the next video. Or the third option is I could EQ going into the reverb. So what I'm going to do here is actually turn off this reverb for now and just solo on the signal that's coming in. So we'll hear a little bit of a balance between these two parts. And now what I can do is very simply EQ this. So we'll go with the classic. We're just going to put a high pass filter on and remove the low end, low end. So this means going into the reverb, it is not going to get any of that low sub frequency at all anymore. This is what it's going to be receiving. And then if I want to add a little more sparkle to the reverb, which is common, I might go in, change this to a shelf, and just add 2 or 3 dB. So this is what we had without any EQ. This is what was originally going into the reverb. And then when I turn this on, that's what we will have going into the reverb after the fact. So now let's bring this reverb in. I might bring this up just a little bit more. So with just that basic reverb going in, we've eliminated that problem. We could take this out of solo mode, and then we could reset our balances.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And with the EQ out,
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
simple strategy, something that's used all the time. Most people actually do this before inserting any kind of reverb. And remember, you might actually have a built-in EQ in your reverb, and if that's the case, you want to make sure you find out if that's occurring pre or post, and then setting accordingly. Don't forget, you could also combine this strategy with something like compression. So let's just set that up really quickly, all pre. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just kind of isolate one particular band. And this is a really fun technique, but
Jalesmin sannidhim.
So I'm going to have to send a lot more in here to make sure that we actually hear it. So let's just send it all in. And then I'm also going to compress this. So this is like the double whammy. So where's my good friend Dynamics? There it is.
Jalesmin sannidhim.
So this is a little bonus for you.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So that's now bringing them together a little bit more. And then we can turn the reverb on. So we're going to get that little sparkle on top. And then in this example, I'm just going to fade this in using the slider. This is something that's probably more appropriate for some kind of parallel configuration anyway. So let's start to add this guy in.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin
We'll over-exaggerate so you can hear it.
sannidhim kuru.
really cool effects. So that might be something you want to experiment with moving forward. Equalization on the way out. So the signal flow here is the reverb followed by the EQ, just like what we talked about with compression. Okay, it's very much the same way, and the difference is going in and going out. EQ on the way out means that it's already gone through that signal and you're now EQing specifically the reverb. So if a lot of a low end, for example, has gotten into the reverb, you could then go and put an EQ after the fact and try to do the same thing. So clean things up. But then here, you can sometimes leave a little bit of that in, which may be something you want to go for. So a lot of times with compression, I very rarely would compress on the way out. But with EQ, I very commonly will because I still like getting a little bit of that effect. It all depends on the context, obviously. But, you could use this for a variety of reasons. And if you already have taken care of the things in advance, for example, eliminating low end, adding additional shimmer, on the way out, you could have another EQ that's really there just to enhance the overall blend of the mix. So primary applications, it really does vary based on the situation. And normally, if you've already thought about EQ going in, this can be quite subtle. Remember that you are now shaping the reverb itself. Many would consider this an unnatural approach, but again, that doesn't mean that it won't work and oftentimes does work. You look at a lot of reverbs that are out on the market right now, they have a lot of EQs on the way out. So if you go and you look at your reverb, a lot of times it will actually tell you where that EQ sits in the signal flow. And so if it sits before or after, you might approach it a little bit differently. Working with external effects, we can really get our fine-tuned control over this and determine what we want to do before and what we want to do after. Especially in cases where the reverb is very audible, EQ out works a lot better than compression out because it's a static effect. So you're not actually hearing the release curve kicking in, or you're not really hearing that drastic gain reduction that you get with something that isn't static, something that is moving. But EQ is static. It just is what it is. It's taking the signal that's coming in and it's just either cutting things out or boosting things up, which is why I actually do tend to use EQ out on reverb a lot. And let's just go in here and do the example of it. So we have our same little template before. We'll just over exaggerate our sends here just to get things started.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So again, we can listen to just the reverb. We're hearing some of those little low-end issues. So if I bring in an EQ to this party, I can go and I can actually kind of do what we did before, only now I'm processing the reverb. I'm not processing the sounds coming into it. I'm processing the sounds coming out of it. And this reverb actually gives us this thing called wet effects. So I could stick that in there if I was doing this just on a channel. But since your reverb probably doesn't have that, I'm just going to go ahead and do the traditional signal flow here. So let's just go ahead here and add a high pass. Then I could do something like maybe I want to actually cut the area where the vocal is mainly sticking out. Just listen to this real quick.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So I might do something like that, and then at the top I'll add again a little bit of a shimmery boost just for fun. So let's actually bring this guy down to maybe more like 8K, 7K region, and just be pretty liberal with it.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
That's probably way too much. The reason why it's sounding like it's way too much is because we're sending in a lot. But
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So now let's go ahead and just bring these all back together in context, readjust our sends.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So there you go, reverb followed by EQ. Simple strategy, but it can get you a lot of great results. Who would have thought that you would put a delay before a reverb? Well, a lot of people have thought about it, and it's really done as a means of efficiency. So the signal flow would be the delay and then the reverb. So you might be asking yourself, well, if it's the delay followed by the reverb, how do we need to set that wet-dry balance? And the answer is you will probably want to set it to 100% if you're going for this type of effect. And so then you ask, well, isn't this more of a delay that's being processed by a reverb? You could certainly argue that. The difference here is that we have both the delay and the reverb set to 100% wet. So the primary benefit here, and there's not really another benefit beyond this, is that you can tempo sync your pre-delay, and I wrote here fast. You can always tempo sync your pre-delay if you have some kind of delay time calculator and you just go into your reverb and then set that pre-delay. But if you don't want to deal with that hassle, you can always just use a stock delay before the reverb to get the exact timing on your pre-delay if that's what you're going for. Secondary application would be experimental. With long enough delay times, here's where I would say you're actually working with more of a heavily processed delay as compared to a reverb. So you'd probably add even more than just the delay and the reverb. That's really now becoming its own separate entity, its own separate effect in the chain. And in that case, the reverb is just there as a coloring agent. And in fact, this is done sometimes with the person thinking in advance, oh, I'm actually setting up a delay here, and then they use a reverb or like just the early reflections as a coloring agent. Works very well, and something that we will look at in the example. Definitely something you'll want to experiment with further. Depending on the delay plugin that you have, this may be more or less useful. In all honesty, if you want to sync your pre-delays to some kind of subdivision of your BPM, it's very easy to do that. Just go to the delay time calculator. You can just search that in Google. You can type in whatever your BPM is and then figure out what pre-delay you can set. I actually had gone in and done that already to find something that would work well with 110. And you can get down to really kind of lower numbers that are still in some way related to this original tempo. Now, in some cases, you might have a delay that gives you really fast times and tempo synced times, but that's not always going to be the case. For example, if I go in here and I grab my delay 1, which I'm going to be putting before the reverb, you can see that the fastest time I can get is the 16th note. I can go faster than that and just set the time manually, but if I was going to do that, I would just use the pre-delay and sync it. So in order to get this effect to work, and at least in maybe more of the traditional sense, I would tempo sync this, make this as fast as possible. I could experiment maybe with 2/16 as well, which would be, I guess, an 8th note, but I'm going to stick to 1/16 for now. And let's go and turn this pre-delay all the way off. Okay, so pre-delay is off entirely, meaning that this delay is now setting the pre-delay. I want to go ahead and let all of the signal come through, and I want to remove feedback entirely. So if we turn this off and we just listen when we send in, and we'll put them together.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin.
You can hear we just have that straight delay going on, and it is synced to our tempo.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So if we want to put it to a quarter note, we could do that all the way up to a whole note. I'm just going to work with a 16th note for now because that would be probably the most likely candidate here. I could also maybe experiment with the 8th note. But let's now turn the reverb on, and now we just have pre-delay being set from our delay device. So
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
if I want to use maybe something slightly longer, I can try it.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
But that's probably almost too long, and it's starting to border now on more of a delay effect. Okay, so this is pretty cool. If I want to, I could set this to something like a half note. This is far beyond any sort of range of pre-delay. And now what we really have is a delay send with the reverb coloring the delay. So in this case, I might bring this guy down.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
filter it out a little bit.
जलेऽस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु
I could even add a little bit of feedback to that.
जलेऽस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु.
And then if I wanted to color this delay even further, ho, 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 I have a reverb I can use. And now the dry-wet balance on the reverb doesn't have to be 100%. It could be something in the middle because we're specifically coloring this delay. We're not trying to use this reverb as a traditional reverb for this vocal.
जलेऽस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु. जलेऽस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु. जलेऽस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु.
So something like that could be a lot of fun to experiment with. So just have some fun, understand that the combinations you come up with here are really endless, and it's just a matter of using your imagination. Delay coming out of the reverb. Of all of the effects and techniques we've looked at, this is probably by far the most uncommon and the most experimental. The signal flow here, reverb followed by the delay. Primary application, experimental, the sky's the limit. Short reverb times and a lot of feedback will equal creative sound design. So if you have a short reverb time, but then you have a delay and you have a lot of feedback going into that delay, again, you're working with almost this entirely new part. You're not using the reverb as it's traditionally used as a reverb. But the whole point of making music in the computer is that you don't have to follow those conventions. I tend to find that this works a lot better with sparser instrumentation, where you can really treat this reverb followed by delay as its own entity, and that's what we'll look at in the example. Reverb followed by delay is certainly a lot more experimental and not something that you're going to see people doing on a regular basis, or it's not a technique that a mix engineer is going to maybe ever consider even doing. But if you're more of a music producer, more of an artist, this is something that you can noodle around with and really turn reverb into a part of its own. And that's what we're going to be doing here in this example. So we have our vocal and we have our reverb sound. We're sending into it.
जलेऽस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु.
And I'm going to send more so we can just really hear how this is working. And one thing I want to do to start with is actually take this width control on the reverb and bring it all the way down. So let's just listen to what happens.
जलेऽस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु.
And I think what I will do is start with the pre-delay all the way down to 0, or I could even go in here and start by delaying this at the beginning. So if I want to delay this at the beginning and then delay it after, I think you'll understand how this is working when I set it up. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to set, let's say, a quarter note before. So it's not going to start coming in until that quarter note. I'm not going to have any feedback. I just want this to be straight, basically simulating a pre-delay, a very lengthy pre-delay. And then I'll have that whole signal be delayed after the fact. So now we do have a little bit of a break coming in. We can bring back in the original. And we're going to get really experimental. I'm going to set this to pre and just kind of have this as the background here of letting us know the difference between the original and the reverberated delay. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to take the width and I'm going to bring it down to 0. And the reason I'm going to do that is so I can actually set up more of like a ping pong delay, a delay that's going to go between the left and the right. And to do that, it makes a little bit more sense to really bring the width back on this considerably. So I'm also going to bring that reverb time down so that the delay has something to grab onto. Now we'll go in and we'll grab that delay 2, which is more of our ping pong delay, 2 different delay lines at the same time. And now let's see what happens. This is going to be fun. I don't need to set this to 100% because I'm really just delaying the reverb, which is being delayed to begin with. So this needs to be 100%. This should be 100% if we're going for the classic. Well, not the classic, but at least the setup that I'm trying to show you. And then this one we can vary. Oops, took the wrong number there. So you get this really cool kind of effect going on here. And then obviously we could get even more experimental and start to add additional effects after this. But I think I'm going to hold off on that because we are going to spend some time talking about using additional effects beyond just the go-tos. And obviously you can put all of these into combination with these new techniques. So now we've created this very interesting blend of an original that's really kind of taking the back seat to this cool little delayed reverb sound that we've created. What I really love about this is when we get to this little second word, the way that everything's blending together, you don't even really hear the original. Right there. That's a really cool little effect. That's one of those happy accidents that you don't expect, but just hearing that now, it seems like something I could actually use and build upon in the actual context of some sort of experimental composition. So after looking at that example, it makes the most sense for us to now talk about the more Wild West, open range, blank canvas approach to processing reverb, which is very simple. You can do anything you want to do. So the signal flow here is going to be varied. You can use chorus, you can use flangers, you can use phasers, you can use frequency shifters, moving filters, auto panners, all sorts of different automation combinations, distortion, saturation. This is all about experimentation. And what I find is that cleaner algorithmic reverbs tend to benefit more from experimental processing techniques. You can try the convolution reverbs and you can try some of the more fancy algorithmic reverbs. And I think you'll have varying results. You'll sometimes really love what happens and sometimes you won't. But don't be afraid to throw anything after or before a reverb and see what happens to it. It really is a way to differentiate yourself and get a new and unique sound. Will it be something that everybody's going to love? Probably not. That being said, will it be something that's ever been done before? Again, maybe not. So go in there, have some fun with it. You know, the classic effect is to use something like a chorus. I think there's a chorus even built into like the Ableton Live reverb. So clearly this is something that's worked time and time again, but you can go beyond that and really just have a lot of fun. This is a chance for you to experiment and think about signal flow, think about effects processing in ways that maybe you haven't considered in the past. Just as a reminder, these are just simple, basic, theoretical examples. In reality, you'd probably be sending multiple things into the reverb if it was a send and return, or if it was something like what we've been doing here with these one-off in vocals, we might set it up in layers and do a lot more processing to just the reverb. In addition, every reverb has its own unique set of parameters that you can adjust and you should adjust. But for now, I'm assuming you understand your reverb inside and out, and you want to get a little bit more experimental with it. You want to use some of the additional tools that you have in your toolbox. And that's what this little example is all about. Really, there's not a lot for me to do here. This is really just the chance for you to understand that you can process reverb with anything you want. It really is one of those effects. If you want to just keep it simple and use the basic reverb, by all means. But if you want something a little bit different, you can also go in and use some of the other plugins and effects that you have. The common things that you'll see reverb processed with are things like distortion, or with like a chorus, for example. And I think I mentioned that Ableton Live's reverb has a built-in chorus. A lot of plugin reverbs have something like a built-in chorus or additional stereo widener type effect. So why don't, for this example, we keep it simple and we'll just go with something like a chorus. So by default, this width, I believe, was at 100%. And what I want to do is I actually want to use the chorus to give me that width. So if I'm playing this back,
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
and by the end of this presentation, you're going to absolutely hate this sample with a passion. But I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to solo out the reverb. And we'll send a little more in. And we'll start to mess around with things a bit. So I'm going to take the width down. To something like that. We'll keep a little bit of the width inherent, but then we will go with something like a chorus effect. And for this example, let's go with a free plugin. Let's use the towel chorus. So I'm going to bring that guy in for now. I'll turn the dry wet all the way off, but I do want to have the stereo width cranked all the way to the top. And now as we start to bring this in, you're going to hear this chorusing effect on the reverb. And again, we don't need to have this at 100% wet. We want to set a balance because we're processing this reverb. So maybe something like that. Maybe just number 2 sounds good in this case. Very cool.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
That's an awesome effect. I'm going to add a little bit more reverb time to this. And I'm going to also get rid of the pre-delay.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
Just a little bit of pre-delay. And now this isn't even sounding like a reverb too much anymore. It's kind of this weird hybridized effect. And people a lot of times are always thinking, oh, what plugin do I need to get? What new thing is out there? A lot of times it's not about getting the new thing. It's about figuring out new ways of combining what you already have. So I could take this even further, maybe add a distortion onto this. And then I also definitely want to work with the high cut filter. And let's see what we can do.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
Then what I think I'd add at the end of this is just some kind of like filter. Let's go in here and we'll use the ladder filter in this example. Or we'll just keep it simple and go with the regular filter since most people have a regular filter in their DAW. Can bring this back to 0.
Sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So something like that. And this is just spending 2 or 3 minutes of experimenting. Obviously, you can spend 15, 20, upwards of an hour just messing around with all the processing you can do to your reverb that goes outside the box. And I think this is the area that still hasn't been fully explored with reverb and that people don't always fully exploit. Because if I was to do this, I might even go in here and actually emphasize the early reflections a little bit more than the late.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin सन्निधिं कुरु
And you can spend a lot of time getting in and just messing around with this stuff. And then if I want, I could just solo out the reverb by itself. We could set something really long. We could go in. We could then take something. Wasn't what I meant to do. Let's see if I can do what I'm trying here. Hopefully I can. But we should be able to go in here now. And for example, take this and bounce out a big section of it. This is just that reverb that we have. I could then chop it up a little bit. Maybe like this. Solo this part out. This sounds pretty cool. Take this guy and then do something really wacky with it. Take the stretch. And suddenly we have this really wonky kind of like bass pad thing. And then I could take that and I could send it back into that chain that we just created. Do something with an LFO on there, who knows? My point is it's so easy to, want to refrain from doing the experimental thing. But when you do the experimental thing, oftentimes it pays off in ways that are so gratifying that you would have never expected when you started. So just thought I'd share that with you and leave it up to your imagination to take these ideas and push them even further. On now to multi-band width control. So this may be a little bit more difficult to set up in your digital audio workstation. It's of course completely possible, but the signal flow here, especially if you have something convenient like a multi-band splitter, would be reverb followed by the multi-band split, followed by a width control in each of those different regions that you have. So whether it's split up into two different bands, 3 bands, 4 bands, whatever. And the primary benefit here is really control. So the primary application would be to really try to get that nice wide stereo image. And that requires you to make sure that the low end is very much centered, okay, so that there's not any sort of muddiness or overlap or lack of clarity. And so that's why I wrote low band would equal slight to no stereo, so all the way down into mono. Mid band, traditional stereo. High band, an enhanced or overly hyped stereo effect. And we will take a look at an example, and I think hearing this one makes such a bigger impact than trying to talk about it. But you can also get incredibly experimental here. You could reverse that, flip it around, see what it sounds like. It's going to muddy up and cloud up the low end, but maybe that's what you're going for. That's not necessarily a bad sound. It's just a different and a unique sound. The other thing you could do is combine different effects in each of these bands along with the stereo width control and see where that takes you. So maybe instead of just using the traditional tool device and a width control, you could go and use a chorus instead and make that chorus very wide. Remember that reverb, just by its nature, is traditionally going to be a stereo effect. Even just taking your reverb and converting the whole thing to mono can be a lot of fun to do. I think in the second course, we did that with the Boogex a couple of times, the reverb that was built into that. And it has such a big impact and such a big difference to what you normally would expect with reverb. It becomes almost this other effect. It's not trying to simulate a room. It just exists as this really unique sound that in some way is related to whatever's being sent in. I find that it works much better to do this technique after the reverb. So I would normally have reverb followed by the multiband, but you could kind of try to do some stuff before if you have stereo signals coming in. Remember that the reverb is in stereo, so if you want to control the stereo-ness of that reverb, it does have to come after, but you could still experiment with what you're allowing into the reverb from before and see if that makes any difference on how that reverb ends up sounding. So if you send something into a reverb in mono, does it end up sounding different to what happens when you send this signal in stereo? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Just something worth experimenting with. For the sake of time and convenience, I'm going to assume that you have some kind of multiband splitter inside of your DAW. If you don't, you're going to have to go back and maybe watch the previous video where we talk about manually setting up a multiband split. But with a reverb, and specifically with a reverb return, it's even more difficult to kind of do this. You can do this without a multiband split, but it's a lot of steps. And it's also more convenient then to have something like an FX layer that you could use. Because if we can take an FX layer, for example, which is right here, I could go in and I could add EQs in 3 or 4, however many bands I want to set up, and I could do that all within here. The bigger issue is, what do you do if you don't have some kind of FX layer? What you'd have to do is actually duplicate the reverb 3 times, and with each of those, isolate a group, and that's just kind of way too much work. So I'm going to assume that you have some kind of a multiband splitter here, and we're going to talk about maybe how you would go about setting this up in a very kind of like practical way. So we went from one extreme to kind of more the other. So we're going to go back to the little loop that we had before.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
There might even be a little bit of reverb on that loop already, but it doesn't matter. We're going to go to extremes like always. So let's send into both.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
Okay, so this is what we have going into the reverb here. So one thing people a lot of times think is, I can't have any reverb on my low end. I can't have any reverb in the sub region. I can't have anything, any reverb below 100 hertz or something like that. And for certain genres of music, maybe it's not beneficial, but for other genres of music, it actually works quite well. The bigger issue, I think, a lot of times has to do with mono versus stereo. Having a really subby reverb in stereo never works really well because it takes up so much room and ends up clashing with the stuff above it. But if you're able to isolate the reverb that's in the low end and put that into mono and leave the rest of it in stereo, it actually can work out quite well. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to use the multiband splitter. And let's use the multiband 3. There's also a 2 version, but I like using the 3 because, you know, things are always better in 3. So if we go in and we listen, I can isolate the lows here of what's coming into this reverb. And I think actually 208 hertz will work perfectly well as a crossover frequency. And so you can hear this a little bit better. I'm going to turn it up. And you can hear how it's in stereo. But if I want, I can go in and I can add a tool device here. And I can basically collapse this down into mono. And now that's going to work a lot better. It's freeing up so much space. And you'll notice that as I start to bring in the mids and the highs, and if you're worried about any real low end, we can always still go in here, grab an EQ, for example, and just filter something out that's really low. Something like that. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to leave the mid band alone. And in the high band, I could actually go and add a tool device and try to make this kind of like super stereo, or I should just say emphasizing more the left and the right. So I'll grab a tool device again. I'll bring that in. Again, I'm leaving the mids alone. And if I wanted to, I could even maybe use a chorus on the highs. That might be kind of interesting. So let's go back to that tall chorus we'd used before. And maybe now I'll leave the width alone first. That's really cool. So we'll do something like that. Bring back in the mids. And now all together we can listen to it in context with the original.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
So without the multi-band split, it sounds like this.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
And then with the multi-band split, we have
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru. Jalesmin
I really want to hear that.
sannidhim kuru.
So there you go. Something very simple, something very practical. You can hear the major difference it makes. We're not getting rid of the low end entirely. We're just making sure that it's only existing down the center. So we're leaving so much space in stereo. Now, this might cause some issues if we collapse the whole thing to mono, but I don't think it should. Let's just take a quick listen and hear what happens.
Jalesmin sannidhim kuru.
It continues to work pretty well, actually. I'd be totally satisfied with that. So there you go, using some kind of multi-band splitter to better separate out your different frequency bands of a reverb. Very practical technique, something that some reverbs actually have built into them, but if yours doesn't, you can always set it up manually. Just like in the last tutorial, this is all about combinations. So these are not standalone techniques, and they're not designed to be standalone techniques. You can combine compression with EQ with chorus, a very common combination that you might see on a reverb, or you can leave everything out entirely. These are just ideas for you. And remember that every production is going to call for something completely different. So you're not going to find that one size fits all or that perfect chain that you can apply every single time. But be willing to mix and match, because that's where you're really going to get the most mileage out of these techniques. And as I wrote here and have already said, it's not uncommon to have a compressor or EQ before and after the reverb, each serving its own purpose, which, as you know on this website, that's what it's really all about here. As long as every single processor has its point and is being used for something, who am I or who is anybody to argue with how you try and apply that effect? Remember, the primary effect here is reverb. When processing after the reverb, the dry wet balance does not need to be 100%, because we're really focused on the sound of that reverb, and that's what we're processing. Just like if we have a vocal and we're processing it with a chorus, we're probably not going to set that all the way to 100%. We're going to set it somewhere in the middle where we get a nice blend. This is the same idea on the reverb itself. You are processing that reverb. And we're talking specifically here after the reverb. So let's say you have a reverb followed by a chorus. It may not make sense to put that chorus to 100%. In fact, it probably wouldn't. So I wrote here, for example, a delay set to 100% wet after the reverb would delay the initial sound of the reverb, which is normally not the intention. So you always have to use your brain. It makes sense to put the delay 100% before the reverb because it's serving as a pre-delay. But after the reverb, if we set that delay over 50%, it's going to sound very unnatural. It's going to be very experimental because you're going to get this soft sound of reverb followed by this louder sound of delayed reverb. That still sounds like something cool. So it's worth experimenting with, but just note that when you do get into the signal flow considerations and processing after the reverb, you want to make sure that you treat that like you would any other effect. So you can be experimental with it, you can be traditional with it, just always have an idea and know what it is you're doing. To wrap things up, you can treat your reverb returns like you would any other track in a production. which means you can go as crazy or as light on effects processing as you want. As long as you have a reason, there are no rules. This is an area in music production that is yet to be fully explored or exploited. There is a lot waiting to be discovered, and you may be the one to discover it. There are a lot of reverbs on the market, and some just simply do not hold up well to external processing. Use your ears. No technique is going to work every single time.